Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, here for the third in our installment of Guests with Katie Metz. And I think we've talked about like 15 ideas. I don't even know
So
so
many.
far. So I feel like she'll be back.
For
This week,
sure. I'm gonna be here.
we're actually talking about an idea that came from Katie when we were talking about where we wanted to go with this series, and it's the idea of adapting to things, subject matter changes, especially for things that change quite often. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that Katie's expertise is in international tax law and policy, and things can shift, I don't know, up to the minute on that often all the time. And so I think this is probably something that you deal with a lot. And I would love for you to just give us some examples of things that, you've had to pivot on pretty
Oh my
quickly.
gosh, how long do you have to talk about this, Becky? Thank you so much for having me back. By the way, yeah, I am in my background, my expertise is in international tax policy and law, and I tend to teach a couple, like 3 or 4 subjects actually that change a lot. And it's mostly at the whim of Congress, to be honest with you, or the whim of somebody more important than me in governance. So you kind of ask like how that is, right? How it's changing, so most of what I do is governed by congressional law, tax law, and U.S. Code 26. International tax law is an extension of that. And although when we think about tax as just a subject, we don't tend to think about it on the international scale unless it's really specific. But actually, depending on who's in office at the presidential level in particular, and to a lesser extent congressional, they care a whole lot about the international side of it. They just don't talk about it as much because the average bear listening to the media doesn't quite care about it, but it has a huge impacts. The other subject I teach that has a lot of policy impact and a lot of infighting, there's always something, right? Always drama, is sustainability reporting and analysis. And that is a subject where there's a lot going on at the international level and at the federal level, and they tend to be really different from each other. So my job changes all the time. I literally read the news constantly to make sure I'm not missing anything. I incorporate what's called a headline huddle in my classes. I mentioned this in the active learning pod, but it's super fun because I was doing tax in the news, ESG, like sustainability in the news, international in the news. And then I was like, why am I doing this when I could like incorporate my students into this? And so now every day a team has to come up and tell us what's in the news for the day and lead a discussion about it, just to reinforce to them that no, you're not like in the twilight zone. This stuff really is sort of really fast, changes all the time.
So what I'm hearing you say is when you're teaching in disciplines that are changing rapidly, you literally bake it into the things you have students
Yeah.
do, because that way it just becomes kind of second nature in the class.
Yes. So in a technical discipline where things change a lot, we sort of have two, I guess, fundamental parameters, or at least I do. One is that I work together if there are other people teaching the same class that I do. I teach one core class, federal tax. So there are 3 or 4 other professors who teach that class pretty frequently. And we kind of get together in the summer and say, here's the fence. So if anything happens with tax policy after that, we can talk about it, but we're not going to hold our students responsible for it. So typically, the fence is July 31st of the upcoming year. And we just keep like 2025 tax law for the 25-26 year. And so we have a conversation about that. And if we want to integrate stuff that's happened after that, great. The second piece, though, is in my classes, at least, I am, in spite of being a policy professor, somebody who, teaches really technical stuff, I am not a fan of the memorize and regurgitate methodology. And so I really enforce to my students that even though we're learning the numbers in this specific way, we're learning this topic this way, things are going to change before you even get to the point where you would be expected to be assessed on this in like a certified exam, certified CPA exam, for example, that you would take later on. And so keeping up with not just the numbers that are changing, but the policy driving those changes is a really integral part of my pedagogical strategy in those classes because otherwise it would just be a hot mess, right?
And I love that idea of like deciding a fence of where you're going to hold students accountable. Not that you can't talk about changes, but and you mentioned them to students, but you might not assess them specifically on knowing the thing
Yeah.
that is evolving really rapidly. I
We
think that's such
can't
a good point.
because it's a waterfall effect. If something changes and we assess that, there are consequences to those changes that we've often already covered in a different capacity. So if we're thinking about this from, content building on itself, I can't change the game mid-semester on them, but I can inform them about kind of the thought process about what's changing. So, for example, when we're recording this right now, the House of Representatives at the federal level is not in session right now, and they should be. The government is shut down. Mike Johnson is not bringing them into session for a lot of reasons that we won't go into. But one of the tricks to that is if they were in session, they would be having conversations about modifying the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed by President Trump on July 5th, 2025. And so sometimes those conversations, there's one code section in particular that they didn't pass that's going to impact my international tax class either way, just from a fundamental policy mentality perspective. We would be talking about what they're talking about in congressional sessions, whether or not that bill might convert to law, and why it isn't right now. And so I teach my policy classes a lot closer to like a law or economics class just to get them in the mindset that this stuff is not stagnant.
I think
I think it's fun, but a lot of people hate it because it's like constant motion, right?
But that's the reality of the world that
Yes.
they're going to get into, and if you approach it from, like, here's the discussion we're having around the things that might change, and here are ways for us to think about what those changes could mean, it engages them within the process, and it helps you stay engaged too, because from
Yeah.
my opinion, what we don't want as faculty is we graduated, we got our PhD, and we are now experts, and that's it, we're done.
Yeah, we can't have a plug and play situation at all. If you make a decision to go into any sort of law, policy, discipline, you're committing to updating things at least yearly, but probably more frequently than not. And it's a trade off. It's a challenge. Anything I learned, even a year ago, let alone in undergrad or grad school, is remarkably different than it is now. That's why we all flinch when any sort of federal election happens because we know the rules are gonna move. But it's a great way to show students, like you said, about the fluidity of our disciplines, right? No matter what it is, that things are evolving all the time, and that it's fun to participate in that evolution when you know the foundations of what you're looking for, what the rules used to be, why they're making those changes, and the motivations behind them. In addition to like the tax strategy that the company might take going forward.
Yeah, and instead of saying, "This isn't decided yet, so we're just gonna keep going the way we were," it sounds to me like you're still having conversations about what things might have to change so that students aren't surprised in their next class when that or their job or their internship when somebody says, "Well, that's not the case anymore."
Yeah, absolutely. And it honestly, it's one of the places where I've been really impressed with my students because I think they keep up with this. They know more. They're motivated to read about it more than we think they are. So when I bring something up that's current event, they've usually at least had a little bit of experience, or they, oh yeah, I heard about that, or sometimes they'll bring up a different bill like that didn't get passed. Why didn't they go through with that component? And it brings up some really good conversations about, again, those shifts and why they're shifting.
And when we're thinking about engaging them in critical thinking, I think letting them know of trends, including that, sharing it even if it isn't fully baked yet is a good way to get them thinking with some of those higher order skills. It's not just about like, this is what is, but this is what could be. And this is why that might matter in the job or career or place I want to be one day.
Yeah, absolutely. One really good example of that actually happened today in class in my sustainability reporting class, where I was talking about tax transparency and talking about how the Biden administration had the Inflation Reduction Act that created a lot of great incentives for clean energy and businesses to start projects with that. So businesses think about, for example, a 5-year long-term tax planning strategy or long-term asset management strategy, and then 2.5 years later Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act completely repealed everything that the Inflation Reduction Act had. I mean, regardless of how you feel about either of those administrations politically, that's what happened. So companies who had this strategy and this tax savings plan and of these long-term projects that they were starting because of all these incentives now are like thinking about how to pivot because a lot of those resources not only went away but were retroactive. They went away before 2025 and they didn't even know that that was going to happen. And so that has been a really interesting way for me to help my students understand how we balance long range planning with short-term decision making, and that it's a really big challenge for companies, but why it's so important for us to integrate all of these skills that we teach and not just teach every subject, every class, every discipline in a silo.
Yeah, I love that, especially the lack of silo teaching is great. So I'm curious, when you're looking at, let's say that you have an assignment built, has this ever happened to you? And it might not have, but let's say you have an assignment built, there's a major change, and you're like, well, this doesn't make sense. And even though I agreed I had a fence where I wasn't going to change things, students might look at this and be like, why are we doing that?
Yeah.
Has that ever happened?
Oh, yeah, happens all the time, actually. It's one of the challenges, to be honest, of my job is that so people in other disciplines, even within accounting, just to teach maybe audit, or I'm not trying to pick on the auditors though, financial reporting, managerial, are pretty much working with the same sets of parameters. Things change here and there, but they take a long time to become law. Whereas tax, I mean, I used to joke about this, but it was real. It happened to me a few years ago, where President Trump tweeted when Twitter was still around for him. And the law changed, and it was over Labor Day weekend. And I remember being on the phone with my friend being like, what do we do? We're about to teach this on Tuesday. Like, what is the law going to be on Tuesday? We didn't know. Yeah, it happens. It, I like it. I think it's fun, but it is a lot more work to engage in that. So one of two things can happen. Like typically I'm pretty strict, pretty adamant with my students about which number they need to be following, which rule they need to be following. And so I update my content every single semester to accommodate, whatever has happened, the July 31 fence. When I teach this class in the spring 2026, we're still going to use the July 31, 2025 fence. But I'll reiterate very, very clearly what number they should expect to see. It actually happened again. The standard deduction increased mid-ship, and I'm like, use the pre One Big Beautiful Bill Act standard deduction because that's what all of the literature is telling you, even though it's like $300 higher right now. Like, don't worry about it. And I actually didn't have a problem with that. So use these numbers, highlight the numbers, use this. If there's a major change where it would significantly impact an activity or an assessment, I tend to update it and make a note. But I I don't expect my students to be that quick in their adaptation, especially if we've learned something up to this point that would make that concept like completely obsolete. by
Yeah,
ch-
when I was, teaching more in sport than I am now, name, image, and likeness was like
Yep.
this for me, like, that stuff
Yeah.
evolved so quickly, and there was 100% days where I would go to the assignment I created for marketing that we were gonna do in November, I created in August, and by the time we got to November, it didn't make any sense and had
Right.
to be
Right.
edited to even make sense for students to engage in, and so for me, it's definitely like if I see a thing that has to pivot, great. But at the same time, I do the same thing you do. Like as a student, work with what NIL means on October 31st for your thing. And if it changes the day before this is due, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours redoing the whole assignment because it changed the day before it's
Yeah,
due, and,
absolutely.
integrate into class, like, you all did the assignment in this way, but here's what changed, so let's look at your outputs and think about what does this mean for the thing you turned in? What would we need to revise
Yes.
or do differently? Because that's a real life learning opportunity.
It is, and, so one of the things that's complicated about tax is that a lot of the rules are temporary or they revert back. So when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 was passed, most of the provisions and my students were, like, confounded about this. I didn't like, you and I both have had kids since the Trump administration, number 1, and so, like, motherhood and life puts us into different perspectives. I didn't even realize they were, like, in elementary school
Yeah.
when Trump was president the first time, and so and so I was like, "Oh, okay, wait, this is, like, hilarious." I was like, "Okay, when President Trump got elected the first time, everybody thought he was gonna serve 2 consecutive terms and then leave, right?" And so what happened was they wrote that bill with the idea that once he left office, it would expire and then somebody else would have to deal with it. But what that didn't happen. What happened instead was, like, his Congress was left, like, basically trying to clean up after all the stuff that they were like, "Oh, we're just gonna let it expire in 2025." Well, guess who's president right now in 2025 trying to get Congress to, like, do what he's asking. And so that was, like, part of the genesis for, some of the tax components. I'm oversimplifying this for those of you in tax
That's fine.
in the reviews here, for, like, a lot of the tax provisions now. And so they're like, "Oh, yeah. It's all temporary. It reverts back. It's most of this stuff is not set to be permanent. It's set to expire at some point, hopefully at a time when, like, the people are gone." And so that's kind of I take a little bit of comfort in that part because it's like, well, it changed right now, but it's probably not gonna stay that way,
And
for
and focusing on the concepts behind, like, what that means and how you need to think about it because
yeah,
it's going to keep changing. It's not ever
yes.
going to be stagnant.
Absolutely. And sometimes what I do is, like, I'll toss in, a 1 point discussion question in their synchronous activity that's like, "Oh, by the way, today the law changed. How would your answer change?" Or assume that now something else is different. How would your answer change? And that kind of helps them understand the parameters of the law while still understanding that the solution can change if tiny things change. I also try not to sweat the small stuff though. Sometimes my numbers are wrong.
It's
Sometimes
not gonna be perfect.
it's not gonna be perfect. It can't be. And there's so much to change every semester that I just can't sweat the small stuff. I have to update the absolute best of my ability and then correct course if something changes or if I realize that I'm looking at an old number on the slides that I handed them.
Well, and I think, we that's not something we talk about often on the pod, but I do feel like if you want to be good at teaching, you have to let go a little bit of the
Yes.
ego piece because
Oh my gosh, yes.
it's impossible to be perfect and have it right all the time in any discipline, but certainly in ones that change pretty rapidly. So you mentioned this that you kind of how you manage it, right? You have the guideposts, you think about ways to integrate it intentionally with students in your class. But it sounds to me like you could in theory change weekly what you plan to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I
how do
could
you make it sustainable? Like how do you do this without going crazy or do you
like,
just go crazy?
what do I say? Like, you don't make it
Yeah.
sustainable. I think one thing that people who are in these types of disciplines accept is that, things are just gonna this is the field that I chose that chose me. I don't know, whatever. Sometimes I will text my husband and be like, "Why did I alpha that hard in college? Why did I choose this subject? What is going on with me?" Because, like, an example, Becky, is my international tax class that I teach in the spring. For some reason, I'm thinking about spring right now, right? And the entire class is gonna have to change because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Like, he changed, I think, 25 a quarter of a percent of one number in the entire like, my entire 7 weeks is gone. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. And sometimes you just have to accept that this is the field you chose. And that is a terrible answer, but you don't make it sustainable. You can't. I live in this field. And one of the challenges of my role as a tax professor is that stuff changes every year, maybe even every semester. Build the fence, have really, really, really good organizational structure in your Canvas site. Learn how to stitch videos together so you don't have to
Yeah,
do
I
the whole
love that.
thing. Learn how to edit quickly and then roll with it. Honestly, I like it. I feel like I'm the type of person where I would get bored if it changed too much. Now sometimes I'm pulling my hair out like I'm gonna be for the spring. Okay, just roll because this is my field, and I was attracted to it because of the policy piece, because it's interesting, because it's law adjacent. And the other side of that is I'm I acknowledge I do a whole lot more work on the front end and sometimes in the middle than a lot of my colleagues do who are teaching more stagnant disciplines. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm
I do like that point, like, sometimes you have to be okay with that, and also,
yeah,
this is a side note, but it is not great for your mental health to compare your own self against your colleagues, even in the same school,
totally.
uh,
Or the same department
the same department,
or same
because
discipline.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's it's you're just gonna have to try not to do
totally.
that.
I do a lot more work to update my classes than I probably have to, and I acknowledge that to my colleagues. I'm also really lucky, I just wanna make this acknowledgement. My department chair is a tax professor, and she gets it. So whenever, anybody's like, "Oh, new semester, all this prep," she really goes to bat for the tax faculty. She's like, "You think you have it hard. All of us are updating all of our content every single year." So I mean, I definitely think there at least my experience in my department is that there's a healthy amount of collegiality and respect for those of us who are constantly in motion, and I think we chose it. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna lie to you. I think we chose it. But yeah, the mental health thing for sure, but, like, I like it. And if you don't like it, then build different fences. You don't have to update that often. So one of the things like I'm running into right now is the CPA exam isn't even going to test the One Big Beautiful Bill Act changes until July. And by that point, I'm guessing Congress is going to have done something different by that point. But I'm teaching it now because my students who are going straight into tax are going to need to know the current law. Okay. Do what you can and move on, right? Survive in advance.
Well, and I think too, I love Survive in Advance. I love that. I think one of the things, a takeaway for people who are listening to this is that, you know, obviously, it's gonna differ by discipline, but we could all benefit from staying engaged
Mhm.
and following some reliable news sources on
Yeah.
whatever platform that looks like. Maybe it's a newsletter, maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a actual newspaper. I
Yes.
know, crazy. People on
No,
TikTok,
you're right,
whatever that
though.
is, right?
You're
Like,
right.
find
One of my
things.
my professionalism guidelines in my class is I expect them to read a neutral, credible business news source every day. Now, I don't test them on it typically, but then I go back and say, "Oh, I saw a really interesting article in the Financial Times today about XYZ." So one of the ways you can kind of think about keeping stuff current, and I do this even in classes, the very few classes where things don't change a lot, is help your students understand that you are reading, you are keeping updated on this, and that it's a good idea to be able to keep updated on your profession. I also, and my students are like almost to the point this semester where they're not making fun of me, but they're close. Where it's like you go to a lot of conferences, like a lot of professional stuff. And it's like, yeah, because what happens is they parade us in, and the big four do a great job at this. They parade us in, they put a bunch of tax professionals. In the case, I was just in DC a couple weeks ago, and they sit us down and they tell us every single thing that's new that we need to be aware of in an from international tax policy perspective, or what's happening on Capitol Hill. And I can go back to my students and say, I was just at a conference a couple weeks ago, and the one of the things that they pointed out I really didn't think about, but now I get is this topic. It doesn't have to be incorporated into my material, but they're understanding that you are staying current, because I think it's so much better to do that. And I would honestly rather do the work than for my students to feel like I'm not teaching them the current stuff, that my class feels stale. Whether that's because I'm not keeping up on it or because like I decided to teach 2024 tax law this year, or whatever it may be. That's not good credibility in any discipline. Like if something happens tomorrow or the Dodgers won the World Series, and like if you don't know that going into a sports management or media class, like
Are you real? That's what you get.
that's
Like,
how
do you
too
belong
early.
here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. As we think about the topic of adapting to the changes, I think a couple things I've heard you say. One is if you integrate it into the class intentionally. When I think about that as a faculty perspective, then keeping up with it myself is easier to make time for because it's part of
Yes.
the assignments, right? So
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
intentional from that
And
perspective.
you already are in the mindset of doing it. I'm
Correct.
already calling my dad to talk about things, talking to colleagues, reading the news, whatever it may be. If it's just part of your day-to-day routine, you're going to be better at integrating it into your class, even conversationally.
Right, and I love that last point you made that it doesn't always have to be about shifting the content. It can
No.
be just about, "Hey, this is a thing I read today. It is relevant for our content. Let's talk about it." And then we move on and we recognize that it's something we need to keep thinking about, but
Yes.
it doesn't have to completely change the core of the things that we're doing.
Right. Especially the speculative stuff, right? So we know there's a code section I've referred to a couple times in here called section 899, which is not law, but it could be. And if it is, it's going to be like really, really impactful. A lot of my students are asking about it. It's like that's speculative. We can talk about it, but I'm not putting it into my class until it's actually a thing that they have to know about, right?
Well, and that was one of my questions for you that and I think we've talked about it a little bit, is just like when you're trying to decide when do changes must, when must they be made, and when can we kind of maybe mention it, but wait and see how it really needs to impact our content or our assignments. Like that line obviously is going to depend on your discipline, but it sounds like if it changes the fundamental way that your discipline works or your assignments need to be done, then you probably need to do it
Yeah.
regardless of the amount of effort it
Definitely.
is.
I personally am a big fan of build the fence at the beginning of the semester whenever you prep for the new semester. We were talking about this like in well, July, the one big beautiful bill act passed on July 5th, like I said. Build the fence, figure out what our parameters are going to be, and then stick with those parameters. Tell your students about it, put it in your syllabus. If something, and then go from there. If something really meaningful and impactful changes mid ship, discuss it. But I don't personally believe in holding them accountable for it on an assessment necessarily, unless it's a speculative piece. A lot of what you deal with when you're talking about NIL, especially, and what I actually deal with more often than you would think is things that are getting held up in court. So, there's a Supreme Court case being decided right now about carbon footprint, right? We can talk about that, the potential implications of it, but we're not going to assess it until we know it's law or until we know that it's measurable, maybe. And although I definitely don't think we should put too much pressure on ourselves to change all of the things, again, I'll reiterate, build the fence before the semester starts and create your content accordingly. But challenge yourself to stay updated and your discipline. Don't teach the same thing over and over and over again just because like the basics haven't changed. There's a lot in tax that I teach the same way I always have. Actually, this week I'm teaching this code section that really hasn't changed, but we're going to talk about it a lot in the context of the stuff that has changed because that's the mentality. Our students want that fresh perspective regardless of how, recent the information is.
Well, and I think this is a good one thing you said is a good ending point for us. I like the idea of making sure you tell your students where that is in a
Yes.
discipline that's going to change so that they know that you know that these things could change and you are making a conscious and intentional choice of where to build your course around
Yes.
because that will help with credibility. That will help if they're like, she doesn't know anything about this clearly because this has happened since then, and, I'm really into it, so I've
Yeah.
been listening to my Tech Bro podcast,
Right,
um,
right. Build
that
the fence, tell them where the fence
tell
is, and
yep.
tell them that that's what we're going to do. And I'll kind of add to that, Becky, that AI does not keep up on these issues nearly as much as we think. I had a student email me the other day and challenge me like, you said this number and I did research and it's actually this number. And I emailed him back. I was like, that number is like 3 years old. Good talk though, right? Challenge your students to operate within those parameters too, because that's ultimately what they're going to be assessed on, right? Whatever fence you build.
And then just, like, being transparent, speaking of transparency a
Yes,
few episodes ago, being
exactly.
transparent about what that looks like in your
Yeah.
class is really, really helpful, so,
And holding them accountable for the current information.
yes, I love that. Well, this was great. I think this is one of those things that as we evolve and change, we'll continue to evolve. The ideas of how we approach this will continue to evolve as well. So, thank you for listening. And thanks again, Katie, so much for joining me. And we would really appreciate you subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with a friend, and any comments you have to help us get better. And we will see you next time.